Hello, listeners. Been wondering how you can help the show? Probably not. But here are 5 things you can do. 1. Subscribe. Support the show by clicking the subscription link in the show notes. 2. Review on iTunes, on our website, www.afraidofnothingpodcast.com, or on whatever app you listen to. 3. Donate. When you go to our website, click the cute coffee cup icon. Or in the show notes, click the subscription link. 4. Share. Sharing really is caring. Tell your friends and even your enemies to check out the show. 5. Watch. Wait a minute, it's a podcast, not a movie. Actually, it's both. Check the show notes to find out where to watch the documentary. You can also rent it on Prime Video. That's it. Oh, one last thing. Enjoy this episode. The first time you experience death in your family, your eyes become wide open to mortality. That happened to me several years ago when my mother passed of Alzheimer's. I also face it with current family situations, a father who's 93 years old, and a brother who deals with a very tough medical situation that seems incurable. But what happens when we die? Is death annihilation, the end of everything as far as we are concerned, or is there an afterlife? And if there indeed is one, what does it look like? Instead of speculating philosophically or reviewing different religious beliefs, Dr. Piero Calvi-Parisetti, in his book Step into the Light, looks at the testimony that we have from witnesses with a direct experience of death. Those who've had a deathbed vision, those who've had a near-death experience, and those who have actually died and allegedly went on living in a non-material dimension we call the spiritual world.
In a world where nothing is known, nothing is certain, reality is not real. Wake up! Be afraid of nothing. I'm Bob Heskey.
Robert.
The host with the ghost.
This is my podcast, based on my paranormal documentary, Afraid of Nothing. Each episode, we talk to people who see life and the afterlife through a different lens. Join me.
Who is this large man? And what's he doing in our bedroom?
As we lift the veil and open our minds to see beyond our eyes lie. This is Afraid of Nothing.
Italian-born Scottish author and speaker Piero Calvi-Parisetti is a medical doctor originally specializing in public health and disaster management. At the beginning of his career employed by the International Red Cross and the United Nations, he worked in the management of large-scale humanitarian aid operations in Africa, Asia, and the former Soviet Union. At the end of 2000, he moved from field operations to the classroom, taking up a late academic career. Until 2015, he has been professor of emergencies and humanitarian action at the Institute for International Political Studies of Milan University in Italy, and a visiting professor at several other universities in Italy, Switzerland, and the UK. In 2004, a simple anecdote narrated by his wife triggered an intellectual interest at first, and then a true scholarly passion for psychical research, especially for the study of scientific evidence pointing to the survival of human personality of bodily death. By digesting some 30,000 pages of literature, attending international conferences and study days, interviewing the researchers, and even training personally with one of his intellectual heroes, Dr. Raymond Moody, the first physician to write about near-death experiences in 1975, Dr. Parisetti became convinced that mind and consciousness cannot be reduced to the activity of the brain, and, in a way which we do not understand, they survive the death of the body. In 2008, he published his first book, 21 Days into the Afterlife, hailed by New York Times bestselling author Michael Prescott as the best introduction I have seen to the survival hypothesis. His other books are Adventures in Psychical Research and Apparitions, Proof of Survival, and more recently, Step into the Light, published in 2021 and directed specifically to those in fear of death. Dr. Parisetti is a member of the Society for Psychical Research and the International Association for Near-Death Studies, two professional scientific research organizations. Dr. Piero Calvi-Parisetti, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you, Robert. It's such a pleasure being with you.
That's awesome. So you are the most distant guest I've had so far. You are coming from, is it Glasgow, Scotland, or what? Where are you calling from?
Indeed. I'm calling myself an Italian from Glasgow because that reflects both my origins. I was born in Italy and where I feel I belong. I belong here. I'm a Glasgow boy, so it's a very rainy Glasgow at the moment.
Look, this is a paranormal podcast. We're going to talk about the afterlife, but do you have any favorite haunts in Scotland that you've been to, or any paranormal places, like castles or anything that you've visited?
I'm not really the haunted places kind of guy. Rather, in Scotland, we are blessed, and mind you, there's plenty of those haunted places, particularly in Edinburgh, less so in Glasgow. But Glasgow has a reputation for being home to some of the most spectacular mediums we have seen in history. Albert Best, I don't know if your listeners on the other side of the ocean have heard of George Best, one of the great football players, soccer players in Scotland. And his brother, Albert Best, was a phenomenal medium, absolutely extraordinary, well-researched and marvelous. His pet student, was Gordon Smith and still is. And Gordon Smith is called the psychic barber because despite running a barber shop all his life, he is one of the brightest stars in the firmament of mediumship. And I've seen him performing on stage. He is out of this world.
Yeah, that's great. We're going to talk about mediums later on. I know you mentioned them pretty much in your book, and you're a believer. But let's first start with some background questions, I guess. So you're a Western-educated medical doctor. How come you became interested in afterlife science?
And I love the fact that you call me a believer, and we'll have a little discussion about that in a moment. But yes, a Western-educated medical doctor, it means that it was inculcated into me that anything that can possibly exist in the world is matter, are things, things you can touch, measure. And if you cannot touch it, if you cannot measure it with instruments or other things, it simply does not exist. And that's a worldview that I have accepted uncritically for many, many years, until, in fact, I was in my mid-40s. And at that stage, I was living in Geneva, in Switzerland, and my lovely wife, who's from Glasgow herself, happened to tell me a little story, a little spooky story that happened to her in her late teens when she was still at home and about to leave, her parents' home here in Glasgow. And in the greater scheme of things, with all the things that you and I, as interested parties in this kind of the line of inquiry, we hear the most extraordinary things. And the story she told me was not the most exciting or the most striking. It was a wrapping episode, which lasted for a few months and then went away when ashes were disposed of. It's intriguing, but it's not extraordinary. And to tell you the truth, Bob, if you at that time had told me such a story, I would have shrugged it off and said, yeah, all right, okay, fine, and let's move on. But that was my wife and the person I trust most in life and I know best. And I could tell that she was still perturbed after all these years by a few months of a spooky visitation, in a way, in her Glasgow home. And so with the stiff upper lip attitude that I had back then, I said, let me see if anything serious has been written about all this. And, well, yes, I immediately stumbled upon the 575 pages of a treatise by a very credentialed psychology professor, the late David Fontana, unfortunately very prematurely departed and sadly missed. And the book is called, Is There an Afterlife? ? And I look up the bio of this guy, and he is incredibly serious. And that sort of overcome my boggled threshold in a way. And boy, did that book make a difference to me. Those 575 pages were followed by, I reckon, another 30,000 to this day, and counting. and I'm talking about books, scientific reports, scientific literature, I became a member of the Society for Psychical Research here in the UK and the International Association for Near-Death Studies in the US. And these are professional scientific research organizations, yes, dedicated, funnily enough, to the very serious subject of possible survival of personality to bodily death.
So that book almost created somewhat of a career change. Can you just give a quick timeline, what you started out as kind of a doctor and kind of when you switched to focus on psychical research?
Well, no, I wouldn't say career change because, psychical research doesn't pay the bills. When this happened, we're talking about 2005 or thereabout, I was a professor of public health at university, and I kept doing that until recently because that's what pays the bill. And my scholarly passion for psychical research, I would say applied psychical research, and perhaps if I have a moment, I will explain to you what that is in a second. And in 2005, I had been a medical doctor for 20 years. I graduated in 86, and then I took a master's degree in public health. And then I went on to work for the International Red Cross and then the United Nations, dealing with humanitarian emergencies. And then in year 2000, I moved from the field and from this operational side of things to the classroom. And for 17 years, I taught at university. So my psychical research persona is parallel to the academic persona. Does that answer your question?
It certainly does. And you did raise a question I was going to ask, which was, what is psychical research?
Thank you for asking that. Thanks, because, I'm a little saddened by the fact that the very term psychical research has gone out of fashion. Nobody speaks about that anymore, apart from this very respected scientific organization, the SPR, the Society for Psychical Research. And psychical research, we can define it as the combination of what we know today as parapsychology, that is the study of unusual human potential, I would say. Things like telepathy, precognition, telekinesis, all those human powers that are very well documented and unfortunately to this day very little understood because we don't know exactly what mechanism is behind. We know that these things exist. They have been proven beyond any possible doubt in the laboratory and blah, blah, but we don't have an explanation. So that's parapsychology. Plus the study of evidence for survival. The study of the evidence that tells us that in a way, again, which we do not understand, because, Bob, I do not claim to have an explanation. I cannot tell you how this happens. According to the evidence we have, yes, we do not die. Human personality does survive physical death. So the study of parapsychology and the study of the possible survival combined are termed what we call psychical research.
Excellent. Very, very great explanation. And I got to tell you, it was almost kind of karma that you reached out to me because I've had an interest in having someone involved in near-death experiences on the show. The first time you lose someone in your family, that's when mortality hits, right, as you get older. And so I lost a mother like 8 years ago, and I have an older brother now who's battling this horrible kind of autoimmune disease where he is just kind of withering away. And he's always been kind of an atheist. He's been kind of a scientist more in the animal. He was a mammologist, pretty well known in that field, and he's dealing with a tough situation. It was interesting when you reached out. I was like, oh, God, I'm so happy to talk to this guy. And I was reading your book as well. We should talk about your book, your latest book. You've written many, but your latest book is called Step into the Light, and it's directed particularly to those who are in fear of death, either their own or loved ones. So how do you think what you've written in this book at a high level, and then we'll dig into it, helps people?
First of all, let me say how sorry I am for the loss of your mum and what you're going through with your brother. You might really, my human sympathy goes out to you. Now, before I answer directly your question, let me very briefly tell you what applied psychical research is, which is really my particular domain of expertise. So we have all this scientific evidence that tells us that essentially. We don't die. Applied psychical research answers the questions, what do we do with that? And early on, as I was studying, and don't think that when you use the term believer, don't think that conversion was an easy process. It was not, because I was and I remain a deeply rational person. I'm a very, how could I say, intellectual person. Before moving over to a new position and believing something else, I really need to be convinced. And I need to be convinced by facts. So what I use in the little counseling I do is afterlife science. The practical use of the findings of psychical research or afterlife science, because we know from medical research and from practice that a rational belief in life after life is of great help to those who have lost a loved one. Let me quickly summarize, and I say this because up to about a year and a half ago, when I've written this latest book, all my efforts were devoted to people who are in pain over the loss of a loved one. And essentially, my point is that there's a part of a pain of a loss which is unavoidable. It is a basic human experience that unfortunately everybody goes through. There's not one person in the world ever in history who could have avoided that excruciating pain of the loss. And that part of the pain, there's nothing to do. There's no pill, there's no psychotherapy, there's no nothing that will take that away. However, there's another part of the pain of a loss which is avoidable. Bob, if you believe that your loved one has ceased to exist, has vanished into a black nothingness, you suffer unnecessarily. Why? Because that is a false thought. That's a belief which is not based on evidence. When you look at the evidence, and I'm talking about dozen different fields of investigation. You spoke about near-death experiences. Well, that's one of about 12 different areas of investigation, and all these areas point to the same conclusion. In a way which we do not understand, our personality goes on after the demise of the physical body. So I've been writing for the bereaved, helping them engage with the evidence, helping them forming what I call a rational belief in life after life, a belief which is based on the knowledge and critical evaluation of facts. When you look at the facts, you don't think anymore that your loved one has disappeared. You know, because you're convinced by the facts, that your loved one goes on existing in a non-material dimension, which we sort of understand. And here we come to my latest book. But we cannot really explain. But the important thing is that that person still exists, still has perceptions, still feels like himself or herself, and critically still have affection for us. I've produced also a series of video lessons and a self-help manual called Love Never Dies, and that captures it all. Love never dies. It's not only our personality that goes on living, it's our affection and the intentions we have for the people we have left behind. And we do have, I don't want to bore you, either you or your listeners with the details of the research, but there's no ways about that. Psychological research shows that, and this is the continuing bonds school of thought in grief counseling, when people understand that their loved ones, that there is evidence that their loved ones go on living, they suffer less. You get my point about necessary pain and unnecessary pain?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, my aim so far has been to try to reduce or, if possible, eliminate that unnecessary part of the pain. And then at the beginning of the pandemic and with all the disaster and the suffering that was, all around us, I thought, but I mean, what I have learned is crucially important for another category of people. And it's those who are facing death. We're all facing death. We're all, let's be frank about it. We never think about it, but we're all scared of dying. And what are we scared of? We're scared of what I said before, disappearing, ceasing to exist, ceasing to have the beautiful or less beautiful experience that we have, but we want to keep having experiences. And we think that we are wrongly convinced, in partly don't get me started on the terrible stronghold that materialism has on a large part of the scientific academic world, and particularly on the media. And the message that you keep getting is that we are our brains. When our brain dies, that's not you anymore. And this is trumpeted down through all channels. Well, that is not true. That it's a scandal. The fact that this thing is presented as foregone conclusion, it's not true, because the same science says otherwise.
Quick question, Piero. So here on Earth, we kind of vibrate like radio frequencies. You go to station, right? We vibrate kind of and pick up what's around us. When we die, do we vibrate on a different level and we're picking up a different frequency? Is there any research into that?
That is a beautiful way of putting it, and it's something that I like to believe, but I have no evidence for that. You see, I make a very, very clear demarcation line. In a way, I'm an educator. I write for people to learn and understand. I want to be very clear about things which are supported by evidence and things which are not. And this is one of them. I like very much the idea, but I do not have any evidence to support it. And let me very briefly tell you that this metaphor, the parallel, the image of a radio receiver helps us understand, maybe not understand, but having a glimpse of the relationship between what we call mind and the physical brain. Because there again, the prevailing view, which is trumpeted down through all channels, is that what we call mind is nothing else than the electrochemical activity of the brain. And they say, oh, look, if you're seeing the color green, for instance, I can tell you that that neuron is firing. And if I damage this other neuron, then you have this particular experience. All right, I answer. That's very interesting. Now, take a radio receiver, a wee transistor receiver. They don't exist anymore, but you probably remember maybe 10 or 20 years ago, we had physical radio receivers, right? And you hear a voice coming out of the speaker, and you may think that the voice is generated inside the radio. And then here comes the scientist that says, oh, look, if I touch that transistor, the voice changes. Hence, that is a proof that the voice is generated in the radio. And if I cut off this other transistor, the voice disappears completely. If I damage the radio, there's no voice anymore. And so you might be led into believing that actually the voice you hear in the speaker is indeed produced in the radio receiver. But we all know that that is not the case. That voice comes from very far beyond. That voice is the product is originally produced by a broadcast, and the radio is just a transducer. It's something that makes that broadcast audible to us. So is to conclude, a good image, I think, of the physical brain is like a radio receiver, as you just said, which tunes into a field of consciousness which exists outside it. And the brain is very important. As long as we are in this bodily form, the brain is the receiver that makes that consciousness interact with the physical world. When we shed our body, we don't need that receiver anymore because we keep being what we were before. That is individualized consciousness.
Yeah, look, just because a radio is broken doesn't mean that the waves and the communication, the broadcasts go away. They're still there. The question becomes, though, when you pass out of your body, Is it just consciousness? What do you think consciousness is, by the way? Have you ever come across a definition of consciousness that you like and agree with?
There is no a single definition of consciousness, but I would like to go one step further to say that, and this is again something that I like to believe, for which I have elements of evidence, but it's a belief. It's just something that I like to believe, is that consciousness is actually fundamental. You know, like gravity, we all experience the effects of gravity, but we don't know exactly what gravity is. We know, however, that gravity is fundamental. It cannot be broken down to anything simpler than that. And myself, like many philosophers and many scientists, are of the opinion that consciousness is equally fundamental, is an essential force of nature, is a field that exists like the electromagnetic field. I'm not saying that it's the same thing, but it's the same kind of thing. It's the same basic component of nature. And let me go a little bit further and perhaps help some of our listeners to have a useful image. If this field exists like gravity, and it exists everywhere, and it's a fundamental component of nature of the world, how come that I feel and exist as an individual? How come that if we are originated by the same consciousness, how come that me, I'm Piero, and you are Bob, and I have experiences that you don't have, and blah, blah? Well, the image I always like to use is the one of the sea. And if you look at a stormy sea, you see a very complex picture in which it's not difficult to think of the waves as individuals, isn't it? Because each wave is different from the other. Each wave evolves in a different manner. It grows, pushed by the wind, and then it rolls. If you look at them from the outside, you think that, oh, that thing is born, develops, grows, and then eventually dies. And you think of an individual that is born, has grown, has developed, has changed over time, and then it eventually dies. But what was the wave before becoming a wave? It was the ocean. It has always been the ocean in expressing itself as an individual. It's a misperception to see the wave as an individual. The wave is a form of the ocean. So Piero and Bob, we are individuals, but in fact, we are expressions of the same fundamental force of nature, which we call consciousness.
I had a guest on a prior show talk about multiple heaven. A couple guests have talked about multiple heavens, multiple hells. I don't know if you know that's beyond your scientific belief, but one guest said when we move on, our soul or consciousness is like a key, and it goes to somewhere that opens a new door that's just for us, where we're supposed to go for people. So it's kind of interesting how he said that.
Actually, if I may, sorry for breaking in, but this is exactly what my latest book is all about. And what we hear from our sources, and maybe we can talk a little bit about that in a moment, is exactly what your previous, I don't know if a guest or a listener said, is a perfect description of what we are told the afterlife is.
Yeah, it was actually, I had a guest on recently that talked about multiple, he wrote a book, a Dr. Brent Satterfield that wrote a book about multiple heavens, which he had experienced, which he was shocked. He was a DNA scientist. He experienced it not through near-death experience, but kind of through an astral projection thing. But basically, first he experienced it as a Christian, and then he was surprised he experienced it in other viewpoints, which blew his mind. That's like a whole nother discussion. And then another guest mentioned the same thing. He had some actual experiences like that, and he gave me the key metaphor. What I'd like to ask real quickly is, you've gone deep into this research. Has there ever come a point in the research where you came across something that made you question your belief, or has your belief only gotten stronger the deeper you've dug into the research?
The latter. However, it's not been an easy process. The conversion, you called me a believer, and I said, yes, I'm a believer today. I'm a rational believer. However, in that, so to speak, conversion process, it was not an easy one, and it took a long time. because old habits die hard, number one. And number two, certain things that you learn about when you look at the evidence are so utterly, essentially incredible, unbelievable. And you say, you read up a report, again, let's take David Fontana, right? David Fontana, Professor Emeritus of Transpersonal Psychology, a member of the Royal Society in the UK, which is the strictest scientific membership you can think of. And the guy who has an interest in these matters at some stage is called to investigate a poltergeist in Wales. He moves there to be near it was a lawn mowers repair shop, which was very seriously haunted by a poltergeist phenomenon. And he moves to that city and stays there for a number of months, and he witnesses the most astounding, incredible things. And he himself, it's great if you read his book, and in his report to the Society for Psychical Research, he's very candid about that. He says, I spend my days witnessing the most incredible happenings, and I end the day convinced. Say, I saw this with my own eyes, and this is happening. And then he goes back to his hotel room, and the doubting mind kicks back in, and he says, no, but this is too absurd. This is not possible. This cannot possibly happen. And so the doubt comes back in. And then the next day, he goes back to the workshop and he witnesses more stuff. And at the end of a few months long process, he is finally convinced and he produces his report. And exactly the same thing happened to me. And this happens to anybody who engages with the evidence with a healthy skepticism. You know, skepticism is not what the so-called skeptics do today. They are scoffers. They are believers into something else, and they will deny and discard anything that does not fit with their beliefs. A healthy skepticism says, wow, this is truly out of bounds. It looks so absurd and impossible. Let me look what's behind it. Let me engage with the phenomenon. Let me engage with the facts, with what's happening, and then I will draw my conclusions. And that's what I've done. And it took me quite a while. But to tell you that in all I've looked at, if there was something that made me doubt, I would say no. There are fraudulent mediums. There's plenty of them. But that's not enough to invalidate the fantastic evidence we have, including in the laboratory, from research mediums, that they actually speak to the dead. For instance, you have probably heard about physical mediumship. Certain mediums are capable in a completely inexplicable way to channel physical phenomena. They do not only transfer information from the world of the dead, but they are a conduit, a channel through which the so-called dead manipulate forces in our world. And so you've got lights and voices and sounds and wrappings and touches and the ectoplasm materializations, etc. I mean, it is as outlandish and as unbelievable as it gets. And I was involved, for instance, a few years ago in a very public squabble, because there's a medium in Germany. Is one of the few in modern times who are apparently capable of producing this incredible phenomenon. And this medium has been investigated very thoroughly, including by somebody I know personally as a powerhouse of intellect and morality. Again, Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at Arizona State University, possibly. Anyhow, Stephen Brody, really, I mean, an incredibly intelligent man and very, very strict. And Stephen and others went and had a number of sessions with this particular medium, and under strict, controlled conditions, the medium produced extraordinary physical effects. Then the same medium was caught cheating in a non-controlled seance. What am I to make of that? You put yourself in my shoes. It's very difficult for somebody who advocates that, for instance, mediums do talk to the dead. A very few extraordinarily gifted mediums are capable of producing physical phenomena. That's a terrible spanner in the wheel. I personally know that Stephen Brody and his colleagues don't lie. They applied incredible controls and yet incredible effects were produced. But the fact that the medium cheated just the once risks invalidating all what I'm saying.
That's a good point. And you do cover mediums a lot in your book, but let's talk about evidence that's hard to overwrite, okay? Your book has a ton of them, but there are two examples I'd just like you to go over pretty quickly if you don't mind. One was the tennis shoe on the ledge at Harborview Hospital in Seattle. It was shared by a migrant worker who had undergone an NDE, a near-death experience, and with a nurse named, I think, Kimberly Clark. Do you recall that?
Very, very well. Near-death experiences are one of the pillars of the survival hypothesis. And there have been efforts to explain them away through about 10 different mechanisms that have been proposed that would explain away the fact that people without a functioning brain have experiences. And that's a non-starter, right? Because if mind is the brain, and during NDEs, the brain is simply not there because blah, blah. And I mean, flat EEG, no breathing, no heartbeat, no oxygen to the brain, and even the most fundamental reflexes are gone. You are all but dead. And yet, a lot of people, we're talking about millions of cases around the world, well documented, well researched. They report this hyper-conscious experience. So the fact that they have an experience whilst their brain is not there is yet another proof or indication of the fact that mind is more than the brain. And so any explanation is a non-starter because they say, it's the lack of oxygen, it's the accumulation of carbon dioxide. It doesn't matter. Not only these explanations do not account for the evidence, they're non-starters in the beginning because these people have no brain, have no functioning brain, and yet have experiences. And one of the most striking characteristics of these experiences is that whilst they have no brain, they are reportedly able to have perceptions from outside their body. It's well known by research that they're capable of describing the resuscitation procedures, for instance, in very minute details. They are able to report conversations between the doctors or what the kind of hairdo a nurse would have whilst they were undergoing resuscitation. But the case of the red shoe is particularly striking, and it's reported by everybody who writes about these things because it's amazing. This woman has a cardiac arrest. She, by all accounts, actually dies. She has a period of several minutes, possibly up to 20 minutes, in which her brain functions are not there. And during that time, she has the perception of leaving her body, watching herself and the medical personnel trying to resuscitate her, and that she moves through the ceiling of the room she was in, through various floors of the hospital. Her point of view, her point of consciousness, if you want, moves outside the hospital, and her attention is drawn by a very strange thing, a red tennis shoes, a red sneaker, which is either hanging or just lying outside one of the windows of this huge face of a very large hospital. And that sticks to her memory together with all the other details of the ND. And when she comes to, when the resuscitation is successful and she's saved and she regains consciousness, she tells this story to one of the nurses. And this nurse is completely, these are the early days of NDE research, and NDEs are not really known by the general public. And the nurse is very skeptical. She says, this patient must have been hallucinating. She's imagined the experience. But out of a little and very healthy grain of doubt, she goes and checks whether, in a very improbable manner, a red shoe is actually on the ledge or hanging from the ledge of one of the windows, as the patient had said. And sure enough, the red shoe was there. And there is no possible explanation. This woman was transported into the emergency room. She could not have possibly seen the red shoe before moving to the hospital. And the only way she could have seen that is if that her consciousness has moved out of the body and was for a moment somehow residing or having perception outside the hospital, and she noticed the red shoe.
There's probably even a more incredible one in your book is about a person who was blind, who had never seen in her life, and then things that she saw after she died, which she reported, even though she had never had vision in her life. There was a blind woman who was in a car accident. Her name was Vicky. Do you recall that episode from your book?
I recall that very well, actually. Not the detail of Vicky. I remember the name Vicky because she's another one that is cited very, very often because it's very, how could I say, has a lot of appeal for the general public. But me, I like, again, to look at my research and my data. And in that respect, the research of Dr. Kenneth Ring is phenomenal. Kenneth Ring is one of the foremost researchers in near-death experiences, and already kind of in the mid-80s, after having heard about reports of possible experience of sight on the part of blind people during an NDE, he wanted to explore this and understand if this is happening and how frequently. So he published an ad on several newspapers, and he gathered a number of people. Some were blind from birth, and some had become blind during their life, and they all had an NDE. And I think that I don't remember the numbers now, but kind of he had 25 subjects, and 23 of them reported what is normal vision during an NDE. Again, reporting verifiable details of their experience, had when they were blind from birth or had become blind later on, and when their brain was not there. The physical brain was not functioning. So Vicky is one of them. And there's another one I cite in one of my books, which almost brings tears to my eyes because it's so beautiful that this person describes moving above the roof of his house and seeing snow. Imagine this person's been blind since birth, knows what snow is, but doesn't know what snow looks like. And his description of the powdery snow being blown about by the wind is so far for me from anything that could be made up. It speaks so clearly to the reality of that experience I find it very, very moving.
Now, we probably only have like 10 or 15 minutes left. Probably what people want to know is what happens when we die and what comes afterwards.
Absolutely. You said we have about a week, right? Is that okay? Is that
a
what
week?
You said? About 7 days. No, listen, let me very briefly make a point here. You mentioned a couple of your previous guests and their very important and very significant experiences. The problem with this is that they're individuals, and we have to take what they say at face value. We have to believe them. They're one person. We have no reason to distrust them. But if we want to form a rational, what I keep calling a rational belief into the afterlife, then why should you believe that person and not, for instance, I don't know, the Holy Quran or the Bhagavad Gita or another sacred text? For me, is a little bit the same. I trust everybody, but I want more. The idea behind my book was that we have very detailed descriptions of the process of dying, what happens before, what happens at the moment of death, and what happens afterwards, coming to us from a lot of different sources. A lot of people have spoken about this. And These people belong essentially to three categories. People who've had a deathbed vision, people who've had a near-death experience, and spirit communicators speaking to us through mediums and through other channels from the so-called spirit world. And in the first half of the book, I engaged the reader in a sort of a scientific detective, like a CSI work, to establish the credibility of these sources. We don't want to hear from one, we want to hear from 100 or 1,000, and we want to make sure that these sources are indeed what or who they claim to be. So we look at the phenomenon of deathbed visions in depth. We look at all the explanations and we see that none really accounts for the evidence. And so we conclude that it is reasonable to trust what is said by these deathbed visions. The same for near-death experiences, exactly the same process, and the same for spirit communicators. We look at mediumship, we look at all the evidence we have pointing to the fact that with a lot of exceptions and a lot of people who are deluded and they call themselves mediums and they're not, but good mediums do indeed talk to the dead, the bottom line. So once we have established that it's not one person reporting one particular experience, but it's hundreds, if not thousands, of these different sources reporting their experiences, and they are credible, because we looked at the evidence and we think that it is reasonable to believe them, then let's look at what they say. And the fantastic thing is that they all say the same thing. Whether you look at it from the end of life perspective, the last 36, 48 hours before death, in which people who have been very ill all of a sudden regain consciousness and describe visions of what appears to be the afterlife and engage in conversation with dead relatives. And they say that they've come over to facilitate their moving, their passing. This is a very, very superficial scratch about DBV's, deathbed visions. And then we look at what near-death experiencers say. And these people have been allowed for 10, 20 minutes to take a good peek into the next world or this other reality. And they have come back and they tell us certain things which are in perfect accordance with what DBV, the deathbed vision, says. And then you look at the testimony from spirit communicators. And again, this is in perfect accordance with NDEs and DBVs. And this is very important because you have independent testimony. Think being in a court of law. To reach a conclusion, the jury wants to hear from different witnesses, and they have to establish the credibility of the witnesses. This is what I do in the first part of the book. Then, what everybody wants to know, what happens? And well, the first piece of good news is that one of the big fears we have, the one of dying alone, is unmotivated. We do not die alone. If the death is not as quick, a sudden death, then generally we are welcome and accompanied and received by either deceased loved ones or either spiritual helpers or other figures who actually come and are with us if we happen to be alone, and they help us passing over. Secondly, very interestingly, the moment of passing is a non-event, Bob. This is most extraordinary for me to learn about this. This is described literally as a non-event to the point that many people do not realize they've actually passed until after a while. If the person has been suffering physical pain, the signal that death has occurred is that physical pain stops. And the person says, what's going on? I was in agony a moment ago, and now I'm perfectly fine. And, oh, God, but look, I'm sort of leaving my body. And I can see myself, I can see my body lying on the bed, and I see either my relatives come in or the medics and whatever. So there's a very similar component of the NDEs, of the near-death experiences. what happens afterwards is less simple than one may imagine, because there's not one afterlife. Or rather, there is one afterlife, but that afterlife has many rooms. It's like visiting a new apartment, and the apartment is the same, but you move from one room to the next. And these rooms, I would rather say, perhaps use the image of floors of a building. The building is the same and it's called afterlife. But there's a ground floor and there's a first floor, and then you go up. And these different floors have different levels. You want to call this vibration? Please do, but that's just a word to me. I don't have any evidence to talk about vibrations. What's consistently described is that the ground level, the ground floor, if you want, is very close to earthly realms and experiences, to the point that people can still interact, and that's where most of the medium communication comes from. But then through a natural, organic process of levitation, of rising, of going up, souls or discarnate personalities, if you want, whatever we are when we are on the other side, this pure consciousness, still individualized, Don't think that we go into a sort of a fog. We're still ourselves, and this is said very clearly. People feel themselves just without a physical body. At the beginning, in the lower floors of the building, they still have the impression of the body, although there's not a physical body. But then as they soar up, they lose the idea or the perception or the image of a body. And the time it is spent in each of these levels or spiritual realms depends on the person. And what your previous guests have said resonates very much with what we are told by these different sources, in that you have experiences in the afterlife which are very connected to the kind of person you were during life. I don't want to get into karma and other things because it's much more complicated than that, but also much more interesting than that. Let me just say two things. Number one, we are not philosophizing. In my book, I'm not fantasizing or trying to draw conclusion. In my book, I'm just drawing on the testimony we have, and it's written testimony, and I quote a lot of these sources, giving the references of where these descriptions come from, who has provided them, under which circumstances, and why they are credible. Number one. And number two, more in general, and this is what really puts a hopeful smile on my face, and that's the reason why I wrote this book, because my desire is that readers who might be in fear of that death may also, at the end of the process of reading the book and engaging with the evidence and the testimony, also have a hopeful smile on their face, because dying is actually good. What awaits us on the other end of the divide is as fascinating, and I would say, broadly speaking, more pleasurable than what we have here. Yes, one of the levels, one of the floors of the building is a level in which we are confronted with what we've done in life, but that is no judgment. This is said very, very clearly with almost exactly the same words by near-death experiences who face the life review, and by spirit communicators who relate about their experience of the life review. We relive every single instant of our material life, and we are made aware of the consequences of our acts on others. And that's all the punishment there is. This is no judgment, and there is no punishment. It's a learning process, because physical incarnations are meant, we are told, again, I'm citing testimony here, witnesses, physical incarnations are used to make experience, to learn, to grow wiser. And this process doesn't stop.
So in the documentary I made, Afraid of Nothing, there's chapters on things like EVPs and ghosts and psychics and reincarnation. And then at the end, 3 of the guests share their experiences. And one of the guys talked about, I thought it was pretty brilliant what he said. He said on Earth, it's air. Here you're in air, you're that's kind of the environment, climate you're in. But in the afterlife, it's consciousness, which is a totally different feeling. And he talked about love as kind of the main energy that was there, which I thought was really kind of fascinating. Mm-hmm. He did have some negative experiences. And in your book, you mentioned that there's 15% of NDEs are not pleasant. Mm-hmm. So not to lead us down a bad path, but just to make sure we cover it, can you talk about some of these negative NDEs or experiences and why you think that they're there, or just kind of the proof that they are there?
Yeah, no. The proof that they are there is that they happen and they are reported. It's a fact that we have to grapple with. And it's a lot easier to explain difficult potential, and I say potential, difficult experiences in the early parts of our spirit life. At the lower levels of the spirit life, some souls have a temporary moment of disorientation, bewilderment, even fear. They find themselves in an environment which is described as dull, grey. It can be from mildly unpleasant to strongly unpleasant, but it is temporary. And there is an explanation, or at least we are given an explanation for that from the other side. And I will come back to that in a moment. It's a lot more difficult to explain negative NDEs or harrowing NDEs, as we call them, because there doesn't seem to be any correlation with any factors that we know. The circumstances under which they happen, the state of mind of the person at which they happen. I cannot offer an honest explanation for the 10-15% of non-positive NDEs. What we are told about non-positive early experiences in the afterlife links back to the Middle Age, maybe year 1200, thereabout. In Christian Europe, there was a prayer very used at the time, very employed, or what people prayed, "Please God save me from a sudden death." And it's the sudden that is important here. Sudden means for an unprepared death. We are constantly told that if a person dies in the belief that there is no afterlife, or with a strong attachment to material life, material experiences, material possession, or maybe an addiction to drugs or alcohol or sex or money or success, those are strong predictors of a difficult entry into the afterlife, because souls still feel the drag, that they're still drawn back into the material life they have just left. And so it takes a while for them to settle down, and then the natural, organic process of soaring, of lifting up towards higher dimensions kicks in, and that period is limited in time. And we are told time and again, and I quote my sources, and I quote word for word what they say from the other side, how important it is to think about death now, to think about what comes afterwards, to know about what comes afterwards, because that is the best guaranteed. That's our ticket into an entirely pleasant experience, because we know what to expect, and then we live our evolutions in the spiritual realms as it is supposed to be. The love dimension, if I may say, comes in at the end. Love, the ultimate love, this ultimate consciousness, which is, the Buddhists say that the ultimate nature of reality is pure consciousness with at its heart compassion, which is love. Or they say it's compassion with at its heart pure consciousness. So this double sides of the same medal between pure consciousness and pure love of compassion. That is the nature of the highest dimensions. So your previous guest or whoever the person was very lucky in having jumped all the intermediate stages and having had a glimpse of that ultimate reality.
We're at the end. I want to ask you one question as your human self, not as a doctor. So my question is, do you believe in reincarnation?
I do, again, based on the evidence we have. The research of Professor Stevenson and all his followers at the Division of Perceptual Studies of the University of Virginia leaves no doubt. We're looking at 60 years of research into reincarnation studies. Also, the University of Reykjavik in Iceland, Professor Haraldsson, leaves no doubt. Reincarnation is a fact. A rational person, based on the evidence, can believe in reincarnation. And reincarnation is part of this grand scheme, that biggest scheme of things you can possibly think of, imagine, which sees life with a very capital L, as a huge cycle that involves many incarnations in the physical realms and many sojourns, many passages through the various stages of the afterlife. And then you incarnate again and you've acquired more wisdom. And I make things very, very simple here. You incarnate and you have experiences and you grow in wisdom. And then you go on to the spirit world and you have more experiences and you grow in wisdom. Then you go back to physical reality at a higher experiential level and you have more experiences. And this cycle continues until you have done your studies. You have experienced what you had to experience. At that moment, the person, the soul, does not reincarnate anymore, and he or she eventually merges back into this beautiful, marvelous, cosmic consciousness / love. And let me end on what I consider to be also a very positive note. We are explicitly told, do not think that merging back into that ocean of love and consciousness means losing your individuality. You are still yourself, but you go back being what you've always been. That is pure consciousness and love.
That's a great place to end, I think. I guess I would have one last quick question would be me, Bob Heskey, me. There are other versions of me theoretically before. So when I pass, am I my personality, Bob Heskey, me? Or am I kind of an amalgam of all the different personalities I was before? Do I evolve? Is this my latest evolution of my personality that I would recognize or others would recognize in the afterlife? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Certainly not. You pass on as Bob with your memories, your peculiar personalities, your interests, and in fact, there are one or possibly two levels of the afterlife in which you continue doing the things that you like doing here, particularly those that have a more intellectual component, a more knowledge component. Musicians keep developing their arts, for instance. Scientists keep studying the problems they've been studying during life. So there certainly is an individuality that goes on. And you probably at some stage, you are also conscious of the previous Roberts and your previous lives, because the moment of reincarnation is crucial, because that's a moment in which you're always helped, where you're never alone in the afterlife either. I'm sorry, I'm speaking as if I had been there myself. I have not. I am just quoting references. I'm just quoting what we are told from people who are allegedly there, and we have reasons to believe they really are, okay? So the moment of reincarnation is the moment in which all your previous experiences come together, and we are told you, together with your spirit guides, actually decide your next incarnation, because you choose what conditions will be there so that you have the experiences that you need to have.
That's a great way to end, I think. Could you just tell us where we can get your latest book, Step into the Light, and your other books? And is there a website, or how could people contact you?
Thank you very much. That's the easiest way, rather than looking up on Amazon. The easiest way is my website, which is dr, like the prefix for doctor, drparisetti.com. And Parisetti is Paris, like the town in France, with E-T-T-I at the end. So drparisetti.com. That's my website. You've got free articles. There's even a free book on apparitions, and there are links to my latest book and the previous ones.
Well, thank you very much, Piero. I appreciate it. This has been a great conversation, actually enlightening and hopeful. So thank you for doing what you do and adding some hope. I mean, I think you have a great message. If we prepare for the afterlife, it'll make us embrace it and accept it more positively and make a smoother transition for us. So thank you very much for your time today.
It's me to thank you, helping all of us spreading the word and helping people having less fear before and having a better experience after the moment of passing. Thank you, Bob. It's been a great pleasure for me too.
You've been listening to the Afraid of Nothing podcast. Please subscribe and like us on Facebook. Until next time, stay scared.
Hey, you're still here? Great. Then why not listen to another episode? Visit afraidofnothingpodcast.com to peruse all the shows. That's afraidofnothingpodcast.com. And while you're there, click the coffee cup icon to buy me a coffee and leave a review. I'll give you a shout out in an upcoming episode, and the world will know how swell you are.